Hey, in this video we will talk about Python versions. You will understand what a Python version is and why it is important to know about Python versions. So let's begin. Let's talk about some history first. Python version 1.0.0 or simply Python 1 was released in 1994. And 6 years after that, Python 2 was released in 2000. 8 years later, Python 3 was released, and currently Python 3 is the current version. Now, these were major releases 1, 2, 3, but there are also minor releases and patch releases as well, which I'll talk about now. So when you download a Python interpreter from python.org, you download something like Python 3.11.2 or Python 3.12.7 or Python 3.10.8, etc. Now, the last number is the patch release. So this is a release of a new Python version. For example, when we switch from 3.11.1 to 3.11.2. So the Python developer team releases Python 3.11.2. And in that release, what happens is that there are bug fixes and other small changes in that particular release. Now, this release is backwards compatible, which I'll talk about in just a bit. Then we have the minor releases. Now, these are bigger features. So it's about, for example, switching from Python 3.10 to Python 3.11. So the second number indicates bigger features in the newer version that is released. And this is also backwards compatible. Now, when we have a major release, for example, when we go from Python 2 to Python 3, there are many big features that were released and the code is not backwards compatible. Now, what does backwards compatible mean? This is what I'll explain right now. So let's look at an example for that. Here, in this window here, I've started a Python 2.7 interactive shell. So I'm using the interpreter of Python 2.7, which was released many years ago. And down here, I've started a Python 3.10 interactive shell. So I'm using the Python 3.10 interpreter down here. Now, in Python 2.7, to print a string, we could use print hello, just like you see it here, without the parentheses, and you'd get the hello string. But in Python 3.10, if you do print hello, like that, you'll get an error. So that means Python 3.10, or to be more exact, Python 3 is not backwards compatible. Because what's exactly a release? A release, for example, when Python 3 was released, what happens is that two things. First is that an interpreter program is created and you can download that, but also the documentation of the language changes to fit this new interpreter. So the new interpreter expects this kind of code, print with parentheses, so like that. So the new interpreter for Python 3 expects that code, and in the documentation you'll also see this code documented. And so this new version of Python, Python 3, ignores the code that was available in Python 2. Now, practically, for programmers, what does it mean practically? Well, let's suppose that you have written a web application and the code is something like this. Let's suppose this is the code. So you have written it in Python 2. And this code is now running on a server computer, and this code produces your website, your web application. But now Python 3 is released. So you have two choices. Either you ignore Python 3 and you keep running this code using your Python 2.7 interpreter or 2.6 or whatever, so Python 2, and your app will keep running just fine, right? So you can ignore Python 3. Or the other option is that you go to your codes and you make the necessary changes. So you add parentheses here in this hello string, and here row input, you change it to input, because in Python 3 row input is not used anymore, so input is used instead. And so once you make these changes, then in the server you instruct your server to run your codes using Python 3, the Python 3 interpreter. In that case, you can say that you have upgraded from Python 2 to Python 3. So after doing these two things, changing the code to fit Python 3 syntax, and also changing the Python interpreter to run this code using the Python 3 interpreter. Now this could be a hassle, so many programmers could just leave the code base to run on Python 2 and they don't change the code. But after many years, Python 2 will not be supported anymore, so there might be security issues with Python 2, and in that case, as a developer, you have to go to your codebase and change the codebase to Python 3 so that you benefit from this minor releases of Python, like the minor release here and the patch, which will happen in the current major version of Python. But in the previous major versions, such as Python 1 or 2, these changes will stop after some time. So the developers of the Python team will not be working anymore on Python 2. So that's what you should know about Python versions. Now, as a learner, it doesn't really matter if you're using Python 3.10 or Python 3.12. The changes are very, very small. And so the code you wrote using Python 3.10 in mind will work even if you run it with Python 3.12 later on, because you are still in the same major version. Only if Python 4 is released later on, then you might want to think about upgrading your code to Python 4, as I explained when I did the comparison between Python 2 and 3. Yeah, with that, thanks and see you later.